They say Christmas miracles come wrapped in snow and starlight, but in the winter of 1885, one arrived on the last stage before the mountain pass froze over, wearing a threadbare coat and carrying secrets that would either save a dying ranch or destroy it completely. The rancher, who waited at that frozen depot, had placed his advertisement months ago, desperate for a wife who could cook and keep house, never imagining that the woman who answered would bring skills far more valuable and dangerous than anything he'd asked for. What he didn't know, what nobody in that small frontier town could have guessed, was that his mail-order bride was running from men who would kill to get her back, and that the talent hidden in her delicate hands would soon become the only thing standing between his dream and total ruin. This is the story of how a Christmas bride became a Christmas warrior, and how sometimes the gifts we need most arrive in the most unexpected packages. Daniel Cooper stood on the platform with his hat in his hands and his heart in his throat, watching the stagecoach roll to a stop in a cloud of frozen breath and creaking wheels. He was 32 years old and felt ancient, worn down by 3 years of drought and bad luck that had reduced his once thriving cattle ranch to a handful of skinny steers and a mortgage he couldn't pay. His neighbors had already lost their land to the bank, and Daniel knew he was next, unless he could find a way to turn things around before spring. He'd placed the advertisement for a mail-order bride partly because he needed help running the place and partly because the loneliness was eating him alive, but mostly because some desperate part of him believed that maybe a fresh start with another person might change his fortune. When the coach door opened and a woman stepped down into the snow, Daniel felt his breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She was small and slender, with dark hair tucked under a worn bonnet, and her eyes were the color of winter moss, green and gray and full of shadows. She carried one small carpet bag and moved with a careful grace that made Daniel think of wild deer, always ready to run. When she saw him, she stopped and studied his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed, like she could see right through to all his failures and fears. Then she smiled, and it transformed her entire face from merely pretty to something that made his heart skip. "Mr. Cooper?" Her voice was soft but steady, with an accent he couldn't quite place. "I'm Grace Ashford. I hope I'm not too late for Christmas." Daniel found his voice and assured her she was right on time, helped her with her bag, and led her to his wagon for the ride out to the ranch. The silence between them was awkward and heavy, with unspoken questions. Daniel tried to make conversation, asking about her journey and where she was from, but Grace's answers were vague and careful. She'd come from back east, she said, and had no family left to speak of, which was why she'd answered his advertisement. She had experience keeping house and working hard, and she hoped they could build a good life together. It was exactly what she'd written in her letters, word for word, and Daniel noticed that she never quite met his eyes when she spoke. He told himself she was just nervous, that any woman would be anxious about marrying a stranger and moving to an isolated ranch, but something in his gut whispered that Grace Ashford was hiding more than simple nerves. The ranch looked even worse than usual in the dying light, the barn sagging under snow and the house desperately in need of paint. Daniel saw Grace take it all in without comment, and he felt shame burn hot in his chest. "I know it's not much," he said quietly. "The last few years have been hard, but I'm a good worker and an honest man, and I'll do right by you if you'll give me a chance." Grace turned to look at him, and something in her expression softened. "Mr. Cooper, I didn't come here expecting a palace. I came here hoping for safety and a fresh start. If you can give me that, then we'll figure out the rest together." They were married the next morning by the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through, with 2 ranch hands as witnesses and snow falling like blessing outside the church windows. It was Christmas Eve, and the whole thing felt surreal to Daniel, like a dream he might wake up from at any moment. Grace wore the same dress she'd arrived in, and when Daniel slipped the simple gold band onto her finger. Her hand trembled in his. That night they had a quiet dinner of stew and bread, and Grace insisted on sleeping in the small guest room, saying she needed time to adjust before they truly became husband and wife. Daniel agreed readily, relieved and disappointed in equal measure, and lay awake in his own bed, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. The next few days passed in a strange domestic dance as they learned each other's rhythms. Grace proved to be an excellent cook and a tireless worker, up before dawn to start the fire and still moving long after dark. But Daniel noticed odd things about her. She always positioned herself where she could see the door and windows. When riders passed on the distant road, she would freeze and watch until they disappeared. And sometimes he caught her staring at her hands with an expression of such deep sadness that it made his chest ache. On the third day, he found her in the barn examining his tools with the focused attention of someone who actually knew what they were looking at. When she picked up his broken plow and ran her fingers over the cracked metal joint, Daniel cleared his throat and she jumped like she'd been caught stealing. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to startle you. That plow's been broken since September. Been meaning to take it to the blacksmith in town, but haven't had the money." Grace set the plow down carefully, and Daniel saw her trying to decide something. Finally, she took a deep breath and said words that changed everything. "I could fix it. I could fix a lot of things around here. Actually, I just need the right tools and materials." Daniel stared at her in confusion. "You know, metalwork?" Grace nodded slowly. "My father was a master blacksmith in Boston. He taught me everything he knew before he died. I've been working metal since I was 10 years old." The revelation hung between them like smoke. Daniel's mind raced with questions about why a skilled blacksmith would answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride, why she'd hidden this talent, what she was running from. But what he said was, "Can you really fix that plow?" Grace met his eyes squarely for the first time since she'd arrived. "I can fix the plow, repair your tools, shoe your horses, and forge new hardware for everything that's falling apart. But I need you to promise me something first. Don't ask me why I hid this, and don't tell anyone in town what I can do. Not yet. Not until I'm sure it's safe." The word safe sent ice down Daniel's spine, but he saw something in Grace's face that made him nod. "All right, you fix what needs fixing, and I'll keep your secret. But eventually, you're going to have to tell me what you're running from." Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel watched his new wife transform into someone he never could have imagined. She set up a makeshift forge in the barn, using materials Daniel had lying around and improvising what she didn't have. Her hands moved with confidence and skill as she heated metal and shaped it, and Daniel found himself mesmerized by the way she worked, completely focused and almost peaceful. She fixed the plow and then moved on to the broken fence posts, the damaged wagon wheel, the dozen small things that had been slowly killing the ranch through death by 1,000 cuts. The changes were subtle at first, but as January turned to February, Daniel began to see the difference. Equipment worked properly. Repairs held. Things that had been impossible became possible again. But Grace's past came calling on a frozen February morning when 3 men rode up to the ranch house with guns on their hips and questions in their eyes. Daniel was in the barn when he heard the horses, and something about the way they moved made him grab his rifle before heading out. The men were city types trying to look rough, with expensive boots and new hats that hadn't seen enough weather. The one in front smiled when he saw Daniel, but it was the kind of smile that made you want to count your fingers afterward. "Morning, friend. We're looking for a woman. Might have passed through here a couple months back. Dark hair, small build, probably traveling alone. Goes by various names, but we knew her as Grace Ashford." Daniel felt his blood turn to ice water. He kept his face neutral and his rifle ready. "What do you want with her?" The man's smile widened. "That's between us and her. She stole something valuable from our employer in Boston. and we've been authorized to retrieve it by any means necessary. Now, you seen her or not?" Daniel had about 2 seconds to decide whether to lie when he heard the barn door creak behind him. He turned and saw Grace standing there, and the expression on her face was pure steel. "I didn't steal anything, Marcus. I took what was mine by right, and your employer knows it." Marcus's smile vanished, like it had never existed. "Grace, been a long time. Mr. Ashford wants his daughter to come home and stop embarrassing the family with this ridiculous rebellion. He's willing to forgive everything if you return the designs and come back quietly." Grace laughed, and it was a bitter sound. "Those designs are mine. I created them, I perfected them, and I won't let him sell them to the railroad company and take all the credit like he's done with everything I've ever made. I'm not going back, Marcus. I'm married now, and this is my home." She held up her hand to show the wedding ring, and Daniel saw Marcus's eyes narrow with calculation. "Married to a dirt-poor rancher? That's a step down from what your father had planned. He was going to marry you to Senator Harrison's son, set you up real nice. Instead, you're playing housewife in the middle of nowhere." Marcus leaned forward in his saddle. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to pack your things and get your designs, and we're going to escort you back to Boston. Your husband here can go back to failing at ranching, and we all forget this unfortunate episode. Or we can do this the hard way, which involves guns and fire and a lot of people getting hurt." Daniel stepped forward, putting himself between Grace and the men. "My wife says she's not going, which means she's not going. I suggest you three get back on those horses and ride out before this gets ugly." The other 2 men reached for their weapons, but Marcus held up a hand. "Easy now. No need for violence yet. Tell you what, rancher, we'll give you 24 hours to think it over, talk some sense into your bride. We'll be camped at the creek about 2 miles south. Tomorrow at noon, Grace better be ready to leave, or we start burning your barn first, then your house, then anything else that'll catch." He tipped his hat with mock courtesy and wheeled his horse around, his men following. Daniel watched them ride away and felt Grace's hand slip into his. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have told you everything from the start. My father's a monster who's built his fortune by stealing my ideas and passing them off as his own. Last year, I designed a new type of coupling joint for railroad cars, something that would save lives and make millions. When I found out he was selling the patent to the railroad without mentioning my name, I took the designs and ran. I thought I could disappear out here, start over where he'd never find me." She looked up at Daniel with tears in her eyes. "I'll leave tonight. I won't let them burn your ranch because of me. You didn't sign up for this kind of trouble." Daniel pulled her close, feeling her shake against him. He thought about the last 2 months, about watching Grace bring his ranch back to life with her skill and determination, about the way she hummed while she worked, and how she'd started smiling more often. He thought about the loneliness he'd felt before she arrived, and how empty the house would be without her. "Nobody's burning my ranch," he said firmly. "And nobody's taking my wife. We're gonna figure this out together." Grace looked up at him like he'd lost his mind. "Daniel, there are 3 of them, and they're armed. What are we going to do?" Daniel smiled, and it was the first time in years he'd felt like he had a plan worth believing in. "We're going to use that hidden talent of yours in a way they'll never expect." They worked through the night in the barn while snow fell soft and steady outside. Grace explained her designs to Daniel, showed him sketches she'd hidden in the lining of her bag, intricate drawings of mechanical joints and lever systems that were far beyond anything Daniel had seen before. "Your father's a fool," he said as he studied her work. "This is genius. You could patent these yourself. Make your own fortune." Grace shook her head. "I'm a woman. The patent office won't take me seriously, and any company I approach will assume I'm lying or that a man did the real work. That's why my father's been able to get away with it for so long. Nobody believes a woman could design something this complex. But Daniel believed, and together they put Grace's genius to work in a different way. They took spare metal from around the ranch and worked until dawn, Grace heating and shaping while Daniel followed her instructions. What they created wasn't elegant, but it was effective and terrifying in its simplicity. When the sun rose on the deadline day, Daniel and Grace were ready. They ate breakfast in tense silence, and when noon approached, they took their positions. Daniel stood on the porch with his rifle while Grace waited in the barn, hidden but close enough to act when needed. Marcus and his men arrived exactly on time, and Daniel saw they'd brought torches and extra guns. "Made your decision, rancher?" Marcus called out. "Your wife coming peacefully, or do we burn you out?" Daniel raised his rifle. "My wife is staying right here, and you three are leaving. Last chance to ride away." Marcus sighed like he'd expected nothing less and signaled his men. They dismounted and spread out, torches in hand, moving toward the barn. Daniel fired a warning shot that kicked up snow at Marcus's feet, and that's when Grace sprang the trap. The devices they'd built overnight were hidden in the snow around the barn, mechanical spring traps that Grace had designed based on her railroad coupling systems. When Marcus's men triggered them, metal arms swung up and locked around their ankles, slamming them face first into the snow. The torches went flying, and before the men could react, Grace emerged from the barn carrying a long metal staff she'd forged. She moved like water, striking with precision and strength that came from years at the forge. Within seconds, all three men were disarmed and on the ground, and Daniel had them covered with his rifle. Marcus looked up at Grace with blood running from his nose and genuine fear in his eyes. "You're insane. Your father will send more men, and they'll keep coming until they get what they want." Grace crouched down beside him, and her voice was cold as the winter wind. "Tell my father that if he sends anyone else, I'll take my designs to his competitors and tell them exactly where his best ideas really came from. Tell him I have documentation proving every patent he's filed in the last 10 years was based on my work. Tell him that if he doesn't leave me alone, I'll destroy his reputation so completely that he'll never work again." She stood up and looked at Daniel. "Tie them up and put them on their horses. They've got a long ride back to Boston." After the men were gone, Daniel and Grace stood in the barn, surrounded by the evidence of their night's work. The tension that had carried them through the fight drained away, leaving them exhausted and shaking with reaction. "You saved the ranch," Grace said quietly. "If you hadn't backed me up, if you hadn't trusted me enough to try something crazy, they would have burned everything." Daniel pulled her into his arms, and this time, when he held her, it felt different, like something had shifted and settled between them. "We saved the ranch together, and that's how we're going to keep doing things if you'll stay. Not as my mail order bride who has to earn her place, but as my partner who makes me better than I could ever be. Alone." Grace looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "I'll stay, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because somewhere in the last 2 months, this stopped being a hiding place and started being home. Because you treated my work with respect when my own father never did. Because you risked everything to protect me from men who wanted to drag me back to a life that was killing me." She kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Spring came early that year, and with it came changes that rippled through the whole territory. Grace's metalwork became quietly famous as word spread about the unusual quality of repairs coming from the Cooper Ranch. Daniel started taking commissions from neighboring farms, and Grace worked in her properly equipped forge, creating pieces that were both functional and beautiful. She began signing her work with a small mark she designed, a graceful G intertwined with a C, and slowly, carefully, she started building a reputation under her married name where her maiden name had been stolen from her. The money from Grace's work saved the ranch and then made it thrive. Daniel was able to pay off his mortgage, buy more cattle, repair buildings that had been falling apart. But more than the financial success, what mattered was the partnership they'd built. Daniel learned to help in the forge, and Grace learned the ranch work, and together they created something stronger than either could have managed alone. On their first anniversary, Daniel gave Grace a leather folder containing patent applications he'd filed in her name for 3 of her most innovative designs. "I talked to a lawyer in Denver," he explained. "Found one who believes women deserve credit for their work. These are yours, Grace. Your name, your designs, your future." Grace opened the folder with shaking hands and saw her name in official type on government documents. Grace Cooper, inventor. She'd dreamed of seeing those words her entire life. And now here they were, real and legal and hers. She threw her arms around Daniel's neck and held on tight, and when she pulled back, she was laughing and crying at the same time. "How did I get so lucky?" she asked. "I answered an advertisement looking for safety and ended up finding everything I never knew I needed." Daniel kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I'm the lucky one. I asked for someone to help run a failing ranch, and I got a genius who saved everything and taught me what it means to really partner with someone. You didn't just fix my equipment, Grace. You fixed my life." They stood together in the barn that had become Grace's workshop, surrounded by tools and half-finished projects and the smell of hot metal and possibility. Outside, spring was turning the brown grass green, and the ranch was coming back to life in ways that had seemed impossible just a year before. The mail-order bride who'd arrived on Christmas Eve with secrets and skills and terror in her heart had become Grace Cooper, master blacksmith and inventor, partner and wife, and the best thing that ever happened to a struggling rancher who'd been brave enough to trust her. Her father never sent anyone else, though they heard years later that his business had declined, as the railroad companies started asking uncomfortable questions about the origins of his patents. Marcus's broken nose healed crooked, which seemed like justice of a sort. On Christmas Eve of their 10th anniversary, Daniel and Grace stood on their porch, watching their 3 children play in the snow, and Grace thought about that terrified woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a carpetbag and desperate hope. She'd been running from a past that wanted to erase her and toward a future she couldn't imagine, and she'd found it in the most unlikely place with the most unlikely person. The hidden talent that had seemed like a curse, something she had to hide to stay safe, had become the foundation of a life beyond her wildest dreams. Daniel wrapped his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close against the winter cold. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, and Grace smiled up at him with all the love and gratitude she'd accumulated over a decade of partnership and purpose. "I'm thinking about Christmas miracles," she said, "about how sometimes the gifts we need most come wrapped in unexpected packages, about how I came here hiding who I was, and you loved me enough to help me become who I was always meant to be." She kissed him soft and slow while snowflakes caught in their hair, and their children's laughter rang out clear and bright. The ranch stretched around them, thriving and strong, built on love and trust and the revolutionary idea that a woman's hands could forge more than just metal. They could forge an entire future. And that, Grace thought as Daniel held her close and Christmas evening settled gentle over the land, was the greatest miracle of all.